No Slushy, no podcast, no deal. And no one else will have what you need, I think.
Hello and welcome to Slushy Stop. My name is Nathan, and I am joined once again by Alex and Jake, where we are going through the Star Wars series, movie by movie, just having casual conversations about each one, leading up to the grand finale, where we are going to play Star Wars Trivial Pursuit against each other. We're going to see who bomb bad at Star Wars trivia.
Oh, God.
That was for Alex.
That was horrible.
Because, yes, you're welcome. So on that note, let's go ahead and dive into Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, which you'll be able to tell soon enough is one of Alex's favorites.
Dissin movie? Bad bombing.
Exactly. But I guess it's probably important to start out, out of the three of us, I am the oldest, and so this movie to me came out right at that point where I was just young enough to still kind of enjoy it, and not really see its flaws. But of course, now that I'm older, I see nothing but the flaws, so I'm a little jaded. But then we have Jake, who's our youngest of the group. Why don't you go ahead and tell us how you relate to this movie?
So, as I've said previously, I first saw Star Wars, it was like 3 or 4. Phantom Menace was the first one that I got to see on a big screen. And maybe because it was the first one I saw in the theater, I just have such a strong nostalgic relationship with it that, I can look past a lot of the flaws. Like, yes, I'm in the same boat as you. I don't like Jar Jar Binks any more than you do. But I'm willing to cast him aside. And even for that matter, I can sort of see what Lucas was going for in his inclusion in the movie. But yeah, for me, it's like, I think episode 1, I think young Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's got like 3 lines, but all of them are cool. We get Darth Maul, which is the coolest of all the Star Wars villains. And you can fight me on that. I'll argue with you till the sun goes down. And then when it comes back up and goes down again, well, I'll go forever. We've got the awesome Naboo starfighters, those yellow ones that fly, like the way they fly, it looks like they're going backwards. And I think that's cool. We have the pod race scene, which is obviously like 15 minutes too long, but it's still pretty cool. So there are a lot of things in this movie that, the child in me still really, really loves.
Yes, and we'll unpack more of the good things about it, because I can admit there are definitely good things about this movie, but there's also equally the bad, in my opinion.
I knew that we were going to be doing this episode, and hand over my heart, been trying to think of things that I could say that wouldn't just be overwhelmingly negative. So far, I've come up pretty short in that endeavor. I think it's terrible. I think this movie is terrible. What did it come out? 98, 99, something like that?
1999.
So I was 9 years old. So I was the target demographic for this movie. I had gotten hooked with the re-release of the originals, which was the plan. It's exactly what they wanted to happen. I remember seeing it for the first time and thinking it was boring, but not really sure why. The only good thing about it was that there were some really cool toys. So I have this giant, like 3.5 foot long Naboo, the Royal Starship. I had that toy, like it opened up and you could pull it out and you could, play with the different levels. There's the hyperdrive was damaged, and it was pretty amazing. And I had the yellow starfighter. I had a Anakin's pod racer. And so when I think about episode 1, I think, what a horrible disaster of a film. But I have some cool toys. Darth Maul, by the way, is cool, but he's not Vader cool.
You couldn't see that, but Jake just shook his head.
We'll come back to that. Maybe. No, he's not Vader cool. He's cool in a different way. My argument is that no, Darth Maul is not Vader cool, but he's sort of on a totally different scale from Vader. I don't know. They're just not really comparable.
Yeah.
I sort of look at them and they both have their own different scales of cool, and they are both sort of at the top of each of those.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, Darth Maul, like, yeah, bright spot could have been, but was that ruined as well? Like, yeah, totally underutilized, underused. Like, I mean, we've talked about this. And so I'm interested to see how this goes, because I honest to Pete, like, I there's not that much good that I have to say about it. I mean, I just think it's such a weird movie. And after watching the originals last week, or the last couple of weeks, in preparation for the previous shows, going straight from those and watching this one, it's just so blatant how terrible it is.
Yeah, and we've discussed that, off the air, but basically kind of what it comes down to for me is the Star Wars original trilogy kind of set this tone, this style for the Star Wars universe that isn't reflected in the prequels. I mean, yes, it's a different time. It's supposed to be, the peak of the Jedi, and the Republic and everything, but for me it came down to just, the use of humor at times.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this movie can't go 5 minutes without some sort of funny moment, and at that, it wasn't even like good humor. It was a lot of the time slapstick, very childish.
Icky coo.
I mean, yes, this was obviously marketed towards a young crowd, and it works for them. But again, it just makes it, like you're saying, it just makes it contrast so much more with that original trilogy.
And I would say, like today, I was thinking about our conversation about A New Hope, and something that Jake said that really stuck out to me. Like, I didn't catch it really at the moment, but I caught it now. Is he's talking about the Star Wars universe being very kind of dirty and lived in, and like doors make noise as if like maybe they need maintenance, and like the Millennium Falcon is a piece of junk, or it looks like a piece of junk, and you watch episode 1 and immediately like everything is super clean and everything is manicured. Everything looks like it's pretty pristine, and the ships are all super clean. And I get that this is like, like Pax Republica or whatever. So it's a time of prosperity and there's no war and all that stuff. I get that, but I think it's a small thing that you pointed out that I've just noticed, is that it doesn't feel real. And part of that's the CGI, obviously, but it doesn't feel real because it's not dirty. It doesn't seem broken. It doesn't seem that kind of like that lived in world that you get, when you're dropped onto Tatooine for the first time. When you watch 4, 5, and 6, you're in this imperial galaxy and everything's like, you got this brutish architecture, this like basically communist bloc style. Everything's like, pretty boring looking. To me, it's weird that like when Obi-Wan Kenobi first talks about in A New Hope, when he's like, something, your father was a pilot, and looks like something the Clone Wars. Like when I watched that movie, I've always thought of the Clone Wars as being like this big, amazing, like World War I-ish conflict, where like you had these very clear, like there were good guys and there were bad guys, and the Clone Wars sounded very glamorous and almost romantic. And I imagine that the universe in which that conflict takes place is not the one that we find, I think, in like Phantom Menace. It's a weird universe.
Well, it's funny how it almost gets kind of meta at one point because, yeah, the whole plot and everything by the Trade Federation really doesn't make a whole lot of sense because in the opening scroll, it talks about how, they set up this blockade around the small planet near the outer rim. I guess you can assume it's like a demonstration for their cause, but it's like, why would you choose this planet? Like, it doesn't sound like it would get a whole lot of notoriety or anything like that. I mean, obviously, unless you want to be hush-hush, they're just trying to, I guess, absorb these planets quietly underneath the, behind the back of the Senate and everything. But still, it's like, why Naboo the whole time? Which, of course, we know it's because, that's the planet that Palpatine's the senator of. But ultimately, it just doesn't make sense to other people, and to where Qui-Gon literally goes, what the Viceroy is doing doesn't make any sense.
Do you think the movie would have been better served if there were some? I remember, like freshman English in high school, talking about the different types of conflict and irony. This seems like a movie that we should have known that Palpatine was Sidious at the beginning. I feel like the movie works better if you know that, instead of like Lucas going out of the way to be mysterious. It's like we already see all this is coming, but should there have been? Do you think? I mean, y'all are the film experts. Do you think it should have been more blatant up front? Like, Palpatine is Sidious, Sidious is Palpatine. Palpatine is orchestrating this whole thing to get him, all this power and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could have been interesting to see kind of, I guess, some of the political gymnastics or whatever that he was having to go through behind the scenes that we can only just assume at this point. Because, like, I found myself in this one, kind of wondering about that. Because there's one point where Palpatine's talking about how Chancellor Valorum is losing power because of, accusations of corruption and things like that. And so I wondered, well, are those accusations of corruption, coming from Palpatine himself? Like,
yeah.
Obviously, I'm sure he's orchestrating those to set it all up. So wouldn't it be interesting, yes, to actually see how he's going about and doing that, because Palpatine is the great manipulator. So,
and that's really interesting, like that story and Palpatine's string pulling and the political drama is really interesting. And so it's really weird to me that we choose not to focus on that. Instead, like the trade dispute, the Naboo thing, that could be a conversation that's happening. Like House of Cards. I'm thinking, like, what if like episode 1 played out what was like kind of House of Cards? How interesting and cool could that have been?
I think Lucas's thinking with making Sidious all mysterious and everything is, gauging that younger audience. Like Nate said earlier, this movie was geared toward a younger audience, and I mean the case in point, like to prove that, is Jar Jar's inclusion in the movie at all, and the jokes every 5 minutes. That's solely to keep the attention of a young child. So I think maybe you make Sidious mysterious, maybe a little kid won't realize it immediately.
I see what George Lucas was going for, but ultimately it just came down to, like, it was just such a superficial mess. Like, everything was very surface level, like the humor, as already stated. But even just the story itself, like you said, it's so thin to where it just felt like, to me, that George Lucas, he knew what he wanted in the third act. That, he wanted this big lightsaber battle. He wanted a space battle going on as well. He knew he had to introduce Anakin and the Jedi. So he had this end goal in mind. And then he was just like, well, let's just do a bunch of crap before that to set it up. It doesn't really matter what, as long as we have, our big spectacles there at the end, which, don't get me wrong, like, that lightsaber battle is great.
Yeah, for me, that tops the list. And it's not even just because I watch Phantom Menace through a different lens than everyone else. Like,
Yes, you better correct yourself on that one.
No, I genuinely think like the Darth Maul, Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon lightsaber fight is one of the, if not the coolest in the entire series. Like, again, I mean, Darth Maul is so cool, and Obi-Wan doing he gets kicked off that bridge thing, and then he has to, he's rushing to catch up, but he's like doing these crazy force jumps and stuff, and yeah, it's just so fun to watch.
I'll definitely agree that is my second favorite lightsaber fight of all the movies. Obviously, Luke Vader, Throne Room is number one, but that's definitely number two. That's the redeeming thing. And the score. I think the score from Phantom Menace was phenomenal.
Yeah, Duel of the Fates. I mean, not to go back, harken back to that same lightsaber fight over, but that song is so cool.
Yes, mad props to John Williams all the way through.
Yeah, great.
And so that I guess that leads to another, positive note about this movie is at least, when Lucas finally gets around to giving a spectacle, whether it's that lightsaber battle or the pod race, that at least the spectacle is top notch. And yes, he's supported by, great score with the lightsaber battle. And I would say that pod race, one of the things I love about it is the sound design and everything. Ben Bird did an amazing job with it. I mean, I I had to restrain myself from getting up before the pod race scene came on and cranking my sound system so that I could hear every little sound, because it's just, oh man, it is immersive.
Yeah.
It's very fast, very dangerous.
But he's the only human that can do it.
Now this is pod racing.
Oh God.
Yeah, I know. In our conversations leading up to this, that was one thing that we did talk about, was Jake Lloyd, and how, unfortunately, a lot of people blame him for this movie, which, is pretty unfair, because, I mean, first of all, like, he was a child actor. On average, child actors are pretty terrible. Yes, there are exceptions, but it's almost a rule that, child actors are not going to be very good. And so for him to be playing such an important character was kind of an unnecessary burden for George Lucas to put on him.
You also made the point that there wasn't really any reason to make him that young. We very easily,
no, not at all.
He very easily could have written it to where, we pick up when Anakin's, at least a preteen.
But that was another thing, I mentioned before too, that, there was just so many missed opportunities. George Lucas, yes, he had some good concepts that misfired, but then there were just other things that just didn't make sense. Like, you have the scene where they're sitting around the table with Shmi and Anakin, and like they start the scene out by talking about how, all the slaves have trackers in them, and that if they, step out of line, they could get blown up. And it's like, that's kind of an interesting concept. Like, why didn't that come back into play? Like, why was that even brought up in the first place? Was that just, needless exposition just to show why the slaves don't run off? Because honestly, that would have create some interesting tension if later on, after Watto lost and had to give up Anakin, that he was like, no, I'm going to get my last revenge, and I'm going to set off the bomb inside of him, blow up that little snot or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you would resolve that, but still, that at least creates some interesting tension there beyond just...
He would have saved the galaxy a lot of trouble.
That's true. Everything would have been over if Watto had just blown him up.
Also, that definitely is Gardula the Hutt in the thing with Jabba at the race.
As I suggested the other day.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if they're, like, related or what. And, like... Again, why randomly introduce someone like that? Why not just have them be the property of Jabba the Hutt?
Easter eggs, man. I know, like, gosh, it's almost like synonymous with the movies now, how many Easter eggs they throw in there. But, I mean, it started with George Lucas, believe it or not. And that's kind of, I guess, one of the fascinating things about this movie. I don't know if that's too strong of a word to use, but, you got to think back. Yeah, this was 1999, and gosh, this was kind of an ambitious movie. to a certain extent as far as the level of special effects George Lucas was implementing at this time. And that was clearly one of his goals is, for the longest time with the original trilogy, he was heralded as, the father of special effects and everything they did to bring the ships to life and everything there. And so it was almost like his second coming with these movies, really introducing the green screen, the CGI and everything, even though it was more of a detriment than a help, at least to especially the later movies. But, it definitely planted this seed in Hollywood that, is why we are where we are today.
I mean, off the top of my head, you can say what you will about Jar Jar Binks and, whatever. There are plenty of horrible things to say. But prior to him, I can't really remember any purely CGI characters, or at least ones that were, even vaguely convincing. And, you can almost, again, say what you will about Jar Jar, but you can kind of thank him for a lot of the characters that dominate the movies today. Look at Thanos in Infinity War. You couldn't have that if it weren't for what George Lucas did with these movies.
For sure. I mean, he definitely set the precedent for our modern day movies and everything. So I felt it was fair to at least recognize that, even though, yes, the execution may not have been top notch, but at least because, I mean, again, that's kind of the frustrating thing though about it is he had these good. I like to give him the benefit of doubt and think that he had good intentions for these movies. But at the same time, I know we talked about this the other day, but it just felt like at times like just a rich man's exploit. That just this guy that had a bunch of money that wanted to make this movie. He didn't necessarily think it through very well, but he did it. And, this rich man just happened to have Hollywood and Industrial Light and Magic at his disposal to really make it more polished. But yeah, there are times where it's just it just makes you cringe, unfortunately.
One of the things that I do really love, and Alex, you and I have talked about it, and even you said you do, the set piece of Naboo. I mean, that planet looks amazing. That whole set is awesome. And even, when you get toward the end and that final battle between the Gungans and the battle droids, obviously they're Gungans. It's hard to take this seriously, but that just looked so cool. You have the city of Theed off in the distance, and the Gungans under this crazy blue shield thing fighting an army of battle droids. That's just a really cool idea.
That was one question I had this last time is, okay, are the Gungans, are they supposed to be a primitive species, like a primitive race? Or, because they don't seem that primitive if they can have shields and all of this, and yet, I mean,
they don't use guns.
Yeah, but that's just it. Their choice of weapons, the fact that they have mounts, but then they also have enough technology to create the bongos and that underwater city. That just has me very confused. But what I did find interesting though this time is, I mean, I'd kind of caught it before, but it really stood out to me this time is that, the Naboo, they don't have a standing military. They just have a bunch of volunteer police officers, or it's all on a volunteer basis.
Militia, basically.
Yeah, and yet the Gungans are basically, they do have a standing military. They are somewhat of a warrior race, and so that's how they do complete a symbiont circle, as Obi-Wan says, because
they defend the citizens of Theed.
So I mean, I'll give that credit to George Lucas, but again, that aside, it is also just very confusing and unclear as how advanced the Gungans are. But
yeah, Captain Panok is cool. There's that.
Also, when I was younger, it frustrated me the way that the final fights were all edited together, because you have these 4 different plot threads jumping back and forth, and it's like as soon as you get interested in one, it cuts to another. But now that I've gotten older, I kind of enjoy that a little bit because each one is kind of cool in its own way. Minus, I still don't really like the Anakin and the Naboo starfighter just happening into the not Death Star thing. Like, that's still not.
And the guns that blew up the Republic cruiser at the beginning just don't blow up his ship for some reason, even though his shield is down.
Yeah, that whole part I could do without. Like, I get it, you're foreshadowing, Luke blowing up the Death Star, and his dad did it too, but
it's like a poem. Yeah, it rhymes.
You're going too far at that point. But like I said, the Gungan and battle droid fight, like it looks cool, and I mean obviously you have that comic relief in there, which misses the mark many times, but it does look cool. And then we've already talked about the lightsaber duel, like top tier lightsaber fight throughout the saga. And then you've got Padme and Panaka and their whole their little splinter group sort of infiltrating their own palace and stuff. Like, that's cool. And one of the parts that's always stood out to me is, when they go out the window and they have the little grappler guns built into their blasters. Like, that's the coolest idea ever. Why don't all blasters have this?
Yeah, kind of, I guess, bringing it back full circle, it definitely feels at many times that this movie was just designed to sell toys. Because, I had tons of Episode 1 toys as well. I mean, I had so many action figures.
Yeah.
I still have them somewhere. And, I mean, it was just excessive.
Yeah, I wish I could say I like this movie in a campy, like Indiana Jones type of way. Like, I know it's totally unrealistic, but I love it. Mm-hmm. I just can't say that. It's not as bad as Episode 2, so it has that going for it. I mean,
yeah, I agree. So many, I've had many an argument with people about that. The argument is always, well, at least Episode 2 has, the Geonosis and that whole fight thing, and it's like, yeah, that's cool, but you have to get there first.
Everything leading up to that point is terrible.
And so I think there are far more redeeming qualities about Phantom Menace than Attack of the Clones. But
you could totally do a fan edit and kind of compress the movie, and it would be significantly better for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of what the problems with the Phantom Menace are. It just there's too much here, and it feels far longer than it actually is.
Well, because part of the problem is you just have a lot of telling instead of showing. Mm-hmm. I mean, like right now, I've got the movie playing while we're talking, and literally we just had a scene, a short little scene too. That was another problem I had with it this last time around. Is it's very superficial at times, and especially and just very inefficient. Like, you'll have a 1-minute scene between two people where they say something, and then that's it, and then you move on to the next scene, and it's just like so much excess at times. Whether because you have like the pod race that just goes on too long, or just so many things that they want to say instead of show. And
again, I think that goes back to that was Lucas doing what he thought was the right thing to capture that young, child audience, because I don't really think that he was giving that audience enough credit. He was just assuming that they wouldn't understand anything if he just didn't put it right on their plate.
But I think it's got a weird problem in that you either have to be a child or an economist with a PhD to like really be able to appreciate this movie. Because while it's ridiculously terrible at sometimes, it's also almost way too smart for its own good. Like, the giant, like it's a brilliant kind of scheme of like this shadowy guy using trade routes and taxes to strong arm a planet into like voting no confidence in the chancellor. Like, but it's almost too smart for its own good. Like, you either have to be really smart or like pretty simple to watch this movie and love it.
It's that, and it's also the fact that I don't think Lucas went very strongly either direction, if that makes sense. You know, if he played it all, you know, just the smart route, I think it could have benefited. Whereas it's,
or if he'd gone purely just the spectacle route and gave us nothing but that, and a very thin plot, that would have been significantly more enjoyable as well.
But he tried to strike a balance in between the two, which, I mean, can probably be done, and I think at times this movie does do that. But yeah, it's definitely a hard balance to strike, and if you mess up, you mess up badly. There's no middle ground.
It's funny. I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think it's really interesting because I think the movie could have used more Coruscant politics. I think the movie could have stood seeing the inner working. I think of a movie like Lincoln, in which you have it does a great job at making the political workings of Washington, D.C. high drama, high stakes, so that by the end, you got that guy running from the Capitol to the White House, you know, and that is an emotionally packed, tension-packed moment. And I think, you know, for all the ways that we could complain about these movies, it's funny to me that we find ourselves saying it needed more political drama and more like, you know, in the corridors of power. But I think it needs that. And if that's the route you're going to go, that's to me, if that's the route you're going to go to build this conflict,
you need to go all in.
You got to go all in.
Yeah, you got to commit. Yeah. And that was the problem with George Lucas. He didn't commit to any of the stories.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah,
because I feel like Palpatine is a caricature, and like, let's see him in his element, like being a political mover and shaker, you know, a Lyndon Johnson type master worker of the Senate.
Yeah.
You know, let's see him popping in on people. You know, he's sitting in their office when they come back from lunch, and he's making things get done. I think this movie, it needed that and could have used that, because Palpatine is such a fascinating character, and we get surprisingly little of him until Revenge of the Sith.
Yeah, and Phantom Menace especially, it's like, as central as he is to the whole conflict, he's left out of it almost completely.
Also,
I mean, you get a little bit
of
of Sidious, which is, you know, meant to be the big bad guy or whatever,
right.
But there's not even enough of him and not a clear enough connection until you get the only time that it's made, that it's even really hinted at in Phantom Menace, is when they're burning Qui-Gon's body and Yoda and Mace Windu are talking about, you know, there always two there are, a master and apprentice. And then you've got that shot from the side where it focuses in on Palpatine. You know, there's your implication there. But like, we needed that way earlier in the movie.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, yeah, we all know who he is, but you need to show that earlier in the movie so that it's clear what the focal point is here. But instead, it's like it starts out with the political stuff and then shifts to this plot about Anakin, and then that's the main plot. But then the political stuff just sort of bounces in and out every so often. And I'm with you. Like, if they're going to go that route, they need to go all that route.
That's got to be, to me, the central part of the movie.
And it might have been a little slower, but I think it would have been better. It would have been more interesting, and it would have, like, a solely politically based movie would have warranted the start of the Clone Wars in my mind.
Absolutely.
Because what are wars typically started over? Politics. It's money and politics and that sort of thing. So
absolutely,
that's a realistic reason for a war of the caliber of the Clone Wars to start.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Having the first movie of this trilogy mainly have its focus on Palpatine and his inner workings, and through his story, the focus on him, that's where you start to introduce the other characters like your Obi-Wan and your Anakin and all these other players, because with him being in the position that he's in, he's obviously going to rub elbows with these guys.
Exactly.
So instead of following them directly, you're getting that introduction to them there, so that way, in the next movie or something like that, you can start bringing them in more. And
it's almost like you'd be introducing the audience to this world through the eyes of a character.
Exactly.
Kind of like A New Hope.
And as I'm sitting here thinking, I do have to give one more. I do have to give credit to one more scene, and it's one that makes me emotional every single time. And I told y'all, it's when Anakin realizes that going with Qui-Gon means leaving his mom behind, and she's like, "No, it's good. You should go." And he's like, "You suddenly, like the gravity of this situation, like a 9-year-old boy having to leave his mom, like behind on a planet, like not just going to school a few miles away, but like that scene,
and
I've always
especially
thought
leaving
was,
her in slavery.
in slavery. Yeah, that scene to me has always been that's maybe the best scene of the movie in terms of the one that I finally feel like I relate to these characters. Like I want to swoop in and save his mom.
And that's also probably his first major trauma that he suffers. So that I think that fact of him leaving her, and then pair that with the next time he sees her, she's dying.
Yeah.
It's very, very clearly sowing the seeds for what he will become. And I mean, what better way to create someone as cold and distant and inhumane as Vader than, at such a young age, tear him away from his mother. Like, yes, he makes the decision ultimately, but it comes back to haunt him. And, I think by the time we get to her death in episode 2, he very much regrets leaving her. And I think that regret is a lot of, that regret has to be a lot of what drives him to the dark side to begin with.
And that reflects poorly on Qui-Gon, in my opinion. Like, that's why Liam Neeson's cool, but like, it's hard for me to watch that movie and walk away not disliking Qui-Gon. Like, he's just not a likable guy to me. And then the dude should have left him alone. He like free him and be like, sorry man, like this, I know you don't understand because you're only 9, but
yeah, I mean, like, he tears this child away from his mother to then whisk him off across the galaxy to then ramrod him into the Jedi Order that doesn't even want him.
Takes him into an active war zone.
Mm-hmm. But Liam Neeson great though in this movie. Like, yeah, you can because of Qui-Gon's decision, it's very, very easy to dislike him as a character. But Liam Neeson plays that role so excellently, and
he does.
And I think Qui-Gon very much suffers from the same problem as Maul. While he's arguably the main character of the movie, at least until Anakin comes in, and then it's sort of divided between the two of them. But like we follow Qui-Gon more than we do Obi-Wan in this movie, and he still doesn't really get a whole lot to do. And then he's killed off at the end. And personally, I would have liked to have seen Qui-Gon more. I want more of that character. So
I feel like it's just another one of those things where George Lucas had a good idea, or at least good intentions, but just wasn't able to execute on it properly, because he was just trying to do so many different things in this movie. He kept everything superficial, didn't flesh anything out well enough for anything to really work properly.
I will agree. As much as even though I do still enjoy this movie, I can agree with that.
So one question that's coming to my mind after talking about the movie, and we definitely aren't fans of it. I mean, or at least we see a lot of the problems with it. So the big question on my mind is, if you were given the reins to do a Star Wars prequel trilogy, what would that look like? Like, how would you fix it? Because obviously it starts with Phantom Menace and then it just goes on from there. So if you could start it off on the right foot, how would you do that?
So we're talking, there is no prequel, and we have all the power to start from nothing.
Correct.
To write the whole prequels.
Correct.
Ooh, I like this question.
Because I know it's something that I've thought about, but I'm curious to see what y'all have to say first.
I like this question a lot. And I'm not going to just say what I wouldn't do, which is what happened. So.
True.
I'm going to, okay, that's a great question. Jake, do you have any input?
It would be 3 movies that would all be 3 hours long, and it would just be Gungans with a cameo from Watto. And the main villain would be General Grievous. And he would have his attack would be spreading an epidemic of bronchitis to the entire galaxy.
Okay, I guess apparently I have to clarify. You still have to set up the original trilogy. So you have to, know.
But I am. You get Darth Vader's respiratory issue.
Gotcha.
And the Clone Wars are just fought with Gungans.
How annoying would be Gungans with bronchitis? How much worse would an already terrible situation be if they had bronchitis? I love this question because I love hypotheticals.
I think
I would not focus it on the character of Anakin Skywalker. That's what I would say. I would focus it. I would jump into the Clone Wars. I would not.
Just run into the middle of it. You don't have to show the origin. I mean, obviously,
right.
People hint at it, but
right. I would not. I would probably have Palpatine would be some high-ranking galactic executive already, not some nobody who is clawing his way. And he's not a nobody in Phantom, I know that, but he might already be some high-level guy. I would jump right in the middle, and the Clone Wars would be. I like the droid versus human battles. I thought that was a really interesting take on it. I would probably, though, make it a human versus alien war, and that would help kind of explain the lack of aliens in the Galactic Empire. That here's this victorious force, and they've kind of relegated aliens to the outskirts of society.
So basically, doubling down on the obvious Nazi references,
absolutely,
connection to the Empire and everything.
Right. So basically, yeah, that's a really good point. So basically, kind of like I would drop you in like 1941, the equivalent of World War II. This thing's been raging for 4 years. You're 4 years to go still, but I would drop you right there in the thick of it with these two forces. Probably maybe the Republic, if that's what you want to call it, at the height of its power. Fighting off this alien. I don't know if I would do separatists, but for whatever reason, that's probably how I would set it up. And then I would have probably Anakin not be some anomaly from this forgotten world. I might have him just be a normal kind of Jedi recruit who slowly goes bad, and I just wouldn't center it on him, because I feel like Star Wars is this great big universe and this great big story. And, I'm big fans of the Red Letter Media guys. And one thing that they said in one of their reviews is that Darth Vader in A New Hope appears to just be one character in this giant story. And I think I would probably keep it that way in my prequels.
Gotcha. So, yeah, a lot less emphasis on Anakin and his fall. Give us more of that war. Kind of like what you get with, I guess, the Clone Wars TV series and things like that. Yeah. And that's probably why it's been so hugely successful.
For sure, yeah. And I think I would set up this galaxy. We're supposed to watch 4, 5, and 6 and see a galaxy that's worse under Imperial rule. And I would counter that in George Lucas's 1, 2, and 3. The galaxy doesn't seem like that much better a place before the Galactic Empire. So I think I would kind of set it up like I would make sure you understood and saw that the galaxy was a beautiful, cultural, artistic, creative, peace-loving place where I kind of think of like the Old Republic games. I thought the Old Republic games did a really good job of you have to have an idea of what is lost by an Imperial takeover, and kind of have this almost utopia situation that gets upended by
a
the rise
utopia
of these,
where it's easy to see how they could take something for granted and how this evil could just root its way in there.
And why rebels in 4, 5, and 6 would sacrifice everything to return back to that state of affairs before the fascist takeover by the Galactic Empire. Because that's one thing that like people argued about Rogue One is like the Empire doesn't seem that bad. Like when does the Empire do anything on screen that's terrible?
It's true. I mean, because they seem like they have everything stable. I mean, as far as we can tell, the economies are, doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
So you're right. Having a point of reference of what this better time looked like before the Empire would add, significant weight to the following events, even in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
So I'll agree with Alex that I wouldn't make Anakin the central character either. I don't think I would drop straight into the Clone Wars while it was already going. I would sort of take the Phantom Menace approach where you see maybe not necessarily the precursor to the Clone Wars, because I mean you could argue that the Neimoidians blockading Naboo is ultimately the catalyst to start the separatist movement and all that stuff. I wouldn't show that far back, but I would show something, show sort of why the separatists formed, how they formed, whatever. Show the beginning of the war, and I mean, Anakin would show up. Certainly wouldn't be a 10-year-old, 9-year-old, whatever he was. Probably be early teens, maybe already in the Jedi Order, in the going through the training or whatever. I do think it is important to include his mother, because I think if you just have him be a regular Jedi who goes bad, that's not a good enough backstory for Vader, for him to be as horrible as he's supposed to be. So
it gives you that initial connection to family as well.
Exactly.
That plays out with him and Luke later on in the original trilogy.
Yeah, so you'd have to include something about his mother, because you have to have, he has to endure the worst of tragedies in order to get to the point that he is at as Vader. So I would definitely want to feature that, but I think I would set it up sort of like the TV show Gotham. In the first season and a half, it was primarily about Jim Gordon and Harvey Bullock, and then Bruce was sort of a main character, but he was like a secondary plot thread. I would do the same, do that thing. Your main character would be Obi-Wan. Because he's already, arguably, he like the prequels already, Anakin's technically the main character, but it's sort of split between him and Obi-Wan. And I would retain Obi-Wan because, one, that's a great excuse to keep Ewan McGregor around.
Yeah.
And number two, just because he's kind of at least in my eyes, he's the coolest character. So
I was going to say, there's no bias or anything like
there's
that.
Certainly some bias.
Side, right?
There's certainly some bias. He's an interesting character. So I would definitely keep him probably the focal point. And then, just have Anakin sort of like a separate, he's there, but he's not pivotal or anything until you get to the third movie. So your first one is setting up how the Clone Wars started. Your second movie is your Rogue One of the prequels. It is a straight war movie. That's when you jump into the thick of it. Like you see it start toward the end of the first
Anakin
one.
Becomes a warrior.
You see it start at the beginning of the first one, and then the second one, you're in it, and yeah, then this focus starts to shift a bit more to Anakin, and yeah, he's become this strong warrior. He's a Jedi Knight now, all this stuff, and you still get that Obi-Wan Anakin dynamic and all of that, and then the third one would be much like what Revenge of the Sith already is. It's the end of the war, the fallout of the war, and the transition from the Republic into the Empire.
And in regard to Vader, I think it would be infinitely more interesting if the conflict was between Anakin and a father. I would not make him fatherless. In fact, I would build the conflict around him and his dad, and because Vader obviously, like, he doesn't know how to be a dad, and I think that would be it's like a poem, it rhymes. If you build that conflict in, and yeah, I agree. From a trilogy perspective, I definitely think I would. You can't ignore Anakin, obviously, but I think I would just like to see. I would like to see. It's. I don't know.
I would include way more Mace Windu, because who doesn't want to see Samuel L. Jackson running around with a purple lightsaber?
Snakes on a spaceship.
Exactly. Yeah. Minox on a spaceship.
That's another good point. I would have gone about the Jedi in a totally different way. I would not have made the Jedi Order at its zenith this monastery type, because we forget now that we had no idea what the Jedi were before the prequels came out, and I would have made them. They were so easily bamboozled in the prequels, and I feel like that goes against so much of what we're supposed to believe about them, and they wouldn't have. There would not have been hundreds of them either, in my opinion. I think there needs to be a handful at the most.
I'll disagree with that, because if Jedi are supposed to be the guardians of, what is it?
Peace and justice.
Peace and justice. I was going to say truth and justice in the American way, but that's Superman. Peace and justice in the galaxy. I think the galaxy is a massive, expansive place. You can't just have a few of them. I think you need a.
To me, they're like a Supreme Court. They're like I would set them up like a galactic Supreme Court. There are a handful of them.
That's fair.
And they're not literally the guardians, but they're the metaphorical guardians of this, this institutional system.
They guard the ideals of the Republic.
And then then make them these, these incredibly powerful warriors that when they do have to get involved, it becomes that's an OP factor. Like, if a Jedi gets involved on your side, it's like Ark of the Covenant level like factor. And that's what makes them, to me, that's what makes them legendary.
Yeah.
Is that, and I would make them these very reverent figures, of which Yoda is one. Maybe he's the youngest one, or just he's not. I wouldn't make him the leader or the most powerful one. Not in the first film of the three. And then I would have, to me, the story of the Galactic Empire. I want. This is where I was going a second ago. I lost my train of thought. I want Anakin Skywalker to believe he's the good guy, and he goes bad, but still believes he's doing the right thing and doing it for all the right reasons. Like, to me, and maybe that's he's stomping out, and we kind of get that in Revenge of the Sith. A good dictator can rule with peace and justice, and it's like we kind of get that, but then again, his eyes turn yellow. And like, we're very aware that Anakin knows he's gone bad. Mm-hmm. I would make that character much like Dune. If anyone's read the book Dune, like the character of Muad'Dib, like he's a guy who becomes the, spoiler alert, skip ahead if you've not read the book and you intend to, but he's a guy who becomes like this ultimate strong-armed dictator in the universe. But throughout his development, you always see why he's doing what he's doing, and in many ways is sympathetic. He's a sympathetic character. That's what I want to see from Vader. I want him to see, I want him to be the ultimate bad guy who thinks he's the ultimate good guy. I think that would be a fascinating story. Obviously, to follow your traditional story arc over the trilogy, 3, the middle one being the low point. I don't have specific points in mind, but you have the, very clear beginning, middle, end to that trilogy, which launches you into A New Hope.
A lot of fascinating points, and now I kind of feel bad for letting y'all go first. I don't know how to follow that up because, with what I've thought about it, like one interesting idea that always kept coming to my mind when it came to Anakin's fall is, I don't know, I kind of want it to be a little bit secretive in a way.
Oh yeah.
Like I always thought it'd be really interesting if, like, say Anakin goes off on a mission with some other Jedi, but like he's the only one that comes back or something like that, or he comes back with a couple others, but like there's kind of like these mysterious deaths that he's kind of maybe able to pin on somebody else, or
right,
to where it's not to where he's already making that transition over to the dark side and already starting to kind of kill off the Jedi, but he's not in full swing yet. Like he's just, I guess it's almost like a psychopath in a way, where he's kind of trying it out before he fully commits.
I love
in
that.
a way. I just thought like something like that would be very interesting to see, because even though we all know he's going to go bad, still to kind of toy with it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
And not make it like quite as obvious to where, because I guess that's maybe one criticism I have is, all along the way, why didn't the Jedi see Anakin's downfall? Like even in Episode 1, Yoda makes it very clear that this boy is very afraid and nothing good can come from training him. And yet he still signs off on, well, if it's good enough for Qui-Gon and he died, then I guess we got to train him now. Like he goes back on his morals pretty quickly there, it seems like. So, so yeah, that's why I think it'd be kind of interesting to have kind of a little more tension around that progression. But then as far as the actual Clone Wars goes, now I'll admit this was not my original idea. This was a theory that I saw online that just sounds amazing. The theory is that the Clone Wars isn't about cloned people or species. Well, it's not about cloned troopers or aliens or anything like that. It's actually about cloned Jedi. So in your scenario, yes, you have a situation where, no, there aren't that many Jedi in the galaxy, but maybe this threat arises to where there's a need to have more Jedi around. So for a good reason, they start cloning Jedi so they can fight off this threat. But then, of course, once the threat passes, then you start having a problem with all these Jedi and some of them getting corrupted or going to the dark side and things of that nature, to where, yes, you have this actual clone war that erupts across the galaxy.
That'd be awesome.
This sounds a little bit, and I don't know if it's canon anymore. I think it is. But the Sith War that was supposed to have happened, before the Old Republic.
Yeah.
Starting out, there were tons and tons of Sith on Dathomir and Korriban, wherever else. And then, they all ultimately went to war with one another, and that's how they eventually got settled on, Darth Bane's rule of 2.
Mm-hmm. So it'd be kind of a similar thing. And so that's why... And so the reason the theory came up is because Obi-Wan, it's always spelled Obi-W-A-N, but actually he was a clone. It was Obi...
Kenobi?
The number 1.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So there's an Obi-2 and an Obi-3 or something.
Yeah, that sort of a thing.
Interesting.
So I mean, from just a spectacle standpoint, that sounds amazing. And there's definitely some very interesting things you can do, because like you said, there are some similar ties to the expanded universe, but that just makes it even better because it's kind of an Easter egg to those fanboys and everything that know that history, and allows you to kind of incorporate it in there. So yeah, a lot of great things that could have been.
That's a great idea. I always thought, I agree with you. I'm going to latch on to something you said. I always thought making the Clone Wars an army of literal clones was a little easy. I just couldn't believe that that's what the Clone Wars name meant. It was literally a war with human clones. I don't know what I expected, but it definitely wasn't that. And also, I imagine that, what makes a war, war is not glamorous, but I think what makes these wars interesting, and the war stories that we find most intriguing and that relate to us most, are the ones in which the good people or the innocent people are at risk of losing everything. And there's real consequences, and there's real damage and real destruction. And I just don't feel like you ever really get that from the prequels. Because, this clone army comes out of nowhere. And so it's basically two equally matched forces. And what I would love to see the Republic, basically getting, squashed by this army. Maybe it's an army from wild space that comes in or something. I don't know, but you never really get the feeling that the Republic is losing in the prequels. And to me, I want to see the Republic getting its butt handed to it, and that's why in desperation the Empire comes about. Like this is option Z. They're 26 out of 26 last shot. And that's how it turns into, because that's how fascist governments come to power. We know that from our own history. Fascists rise to power when people are out of all other options and they're getting killed and they're hungry. And I feel like we never see that in the Star Wars universe. That instead of the Galactic Empire taking power, I would like to see the universe handing power over and saying, "Okay, Darth Vader, save us."
Basically, yeah.
And how cool, how fascinating would that be? People are trying to escape destruction by asking Vader to save them, and that would also explain why the rebels are, they have to be very careful about where they are, because people feel like there's safety and security inside the Empire.
Yeah, because even to that day, you still have your Imperial sympathizers that still think that might is right.
Right. If it wasn't for the Empire, I'd be speaking Huttonese right now. Something like that. And maybe that's a little too close to reality, because that's how people really are. But I just think that would have been an amazing, and I feel like the precedent is set, and that the Rebel Alliance is always having to choose these off the beaten path locations to build their bases. In A New Hope, there are people spying on them who are giving information to the Empire. They're constantly being betrayed. And to me, that I would love to see a case where the Empire is the lesser of two evils in people's minds. And of course, you have these rebels who are still the good guys because they see what's really going on. Like Palpatine is this dictator, and we can have safety and security without sacrificing freedom and liberty. And this is turning into a 2018 argument, and I don't mean to do that, but I just feel like that was a missed opportunity.
For sure.
But I love your idea about the clones being Jedi clones. That would be fascinating.
Well, again, that wasn't my idea. That was somebody else's idea that I just loved and remember to this day. Well, I guess the other thing I also wanted to mention that I wanted to touch on was, about Anakin and his fall. It feels to me that one of the missteps that George Lucas had with it throughout the whole trilogy is, I don't know, this is all speculation on my part, but it feels like, for those of you who don't know, George Lucas is best buddies with Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, who's best known for the Godfather series, which is, a series of movies that basically chronicles one man's, descent into darkness, starting out as an innocent young man at the beginning of the series and then becoming this, ruthless godfather over the course of the trilogy. And so it always felt to me that, George Lucas, he wanted the same thing for his Darth Vader character. that he wanted his own Godfather trilogy that chronicled how someone went down that dark path. However, unlike Francis Ford Coppola, who, well, granted, he was working from books, I believe. I think Godfather's trilogy is actually a series of books. So
Yeah, they were books first.
So it certainly helps to have, a literary text to pull from and everything, as opposed to just pulling it all out of your head like George did. But that aside, still, to try to aspire to that, it felt like that's what he was trying this whole time, was to get his own Godfather trilogy, and clearly he didn't learn enough from those movies on how to best go about doing that in, a galactic setting such as Star Wars. So yeah, just one of those things that always just kind of sticks out to me. Is just that interesting relationship behind the scenes between George and his contemporaries.
That's really interesting. I did not know that about George Lucas and Coppola. I knew that about Steven Spielberg, obviously, because of the Indiana Jones series and all that good stuff. But I did not realize that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Have you never heard the story of how he cast Harrison Ford as Han Solo?
I thought you were about to say the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Have you never heard the story? No. Yeah. I did know that.
Yeah, he was doing.
And I just learned
doing a door or something for Francis Ford Coppola.
Supposedly, Harrison Ford was offered the role of Dr. Grant in Jurassic Park, but turned it down.
How interesting would that have been?
That would have been. My life would have been totally complete if Harrison Ford had been Han Solo, Dr. Grant, and Indiana Jones, and the President of the United States, and Jack Ryan. I mean, it gets no better than that. Give him the EGOT.
All right. Well, good stuff, gentlemen. Pleasure as always. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And, come back for episode 2, where we again will use an exercise of restraint to try not to bash on it too much. But, man, is it going to be tough. But, again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.